The desert wind whispered through the stillness like a secret no one wanted to hear. Beneath a pale, merciless sky, the silence clung to the sand, too quiet for a place that had once known life. Near a battered stretch of dirt road, where the heat blurred the horizon into trembling waves, she stood, tied bleeding, alone. A German shepherd barely more than a skeleton, draped in fur stood, shackled to a sun-scorched tree by a thick red rope knotted around her legs, the same legs that once chased butterflies or guarded her home. Her wounds weren't fresh anymore. Flies buzzed where the blood had dried, and her fur, once proud and thick, was matted with crusted scabs and desert dust. She didn't cry, she didn't bark, she just stared, eyes hollow, as if they'd seen something they could never unseen, as if they were waiting for the end, not with fear, but with the numbness that comes when hope has already left. But there was something else, something her captors hadn't noticed. Just beyond the reach of that red rope, under a crooked bush, clinging to life in the sand, a small figure trembled, a puppy, tiny, underfed, and no older than a few weeks. His ribs showed with every breath, and his body shook with exhaustion, but his eyes never left hers. He hadn't run, he hadn't left. While the sun blistered the earth, and the days crawled by, he stayed, crawling close when she whimpered, licking her wounds when the flies came, and when he could do no more, he'd sit by her feet, his body pressing gently against hers like a promise he didn't know how to break. She had been left to die, but not alone, and not without a witness. What happened next, no one expected, not even the people who found them, not even the ones who thought they'd seen the worst humanity could do. Because the moment the rescuer reached for the rope, something unimaginable happened, something that would not only change her fate, but uncover a truth buried far deeper than pain. And when they followed the puppy's trail through the dust, they found something that stopped them in their tracks, forever. Before we dive into today's emotional story, I would love to hear from you. From which part of the world are you watching this video? It is always amazing to witness our global community coming together. If you have not already, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell icon now. Let us get right into the story. The wind had shifted since morning. What was once a silent stillness in the desert had now become a restless whisper, stirring sand across old bones and dry roots. The tree where she had been tied stood alone, not part of a grove, not a survivor of a forest, but a lone witness to pain, cracked and splintered from years of sun and silence. The German shepherd's wounds were not fresh anymore. They had begun to dry and cake, thick with dirt, the crust of forgotten agony. Her ribs rose and fell with a tremble, not strength, but a stubbornness that hadn't died yet. Her name wasn't known, no tag on her collar, no file in a shelter. She was just the dog tied to a tree. And yet, her story didn't begin here, beneath this cursed trunk. It started somewhere else, in a home that had once fed her, with hands that had once touched her head and called her by a name that maybe meant something once. But all that had vanished, and now all she had was the dry earth beneath her, and the red rope that burned her legs when she moved too much. A mile from the tree, a woman named Claire had just ended a shift at the county clinic. Her boots were dusty, her eyes heavier than usual, not from tiredness, but from the kind of weight that clings to people who see more pain than they can fix. Claire had moved to this desert town for the quiet, for the promise of less chaos, not realizing that some places don't scream when they hurt, they whisper. And one of those whispers had arrived in her voicemail that morning. A woman's voice, trembling, unsure, had said there was a dog in the far east end of the desert, tied to something, maybe dead, maybe not. She wasn't sure. It's just bones and blood, the caller had whispered, but it looked like it was still breathing. Most would have ignored it, but Claire didn't. There was something in the voice that pulled at her, a kind of guilt, or maybe fear. So Claire had gone. She packed a bottle of water, her gloves, and an old pair of trauma shears, not knowing if she was going to rescue or bury. The sun was low when she found the tree. Her truck slowed to a stop, and for a moment, everything felt still, like the earth itself was holding its breath. That's when she saw her, the shepherd. She was still standing, somehow, though her legs shook and her ears drooped from exhaustion. Flies circled her face, and her eyes hollow, yet wide, locked onto Claire like she had been waiting for her, not barking, not moving, just watching, like a soul frozen in time. Claire approached, slowly, kneeling a few feet away. The red rope cut deep into the dog's legs, crusted with dried blood. Her muzzle bore the raw trace of wire or tape that had once been wrapped too tightly. The wounds weren't just on her skin, they were in her silence, in the way she didn't flinch when Claire reached out, as if pain was no longer something worth reacting to. Claire's voice broke when she finally spoke. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, unsure if she was reassuring the dog or herself. The shepherd blinked. Then, gently, her body sagged forward, her head resting on Claire's knee, as if surrendering wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only thing left. But it was then that Claire noticed something else. A sound, faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. She turned, scanning the bushes behind her. There was nothing. And then, again, a cry, uneven, not a bark, a whimper. Claire stood and followed it, her steps cautious but quick. About 20 feet from the tree, under a pile of rusted debris and broken fencing, she saw a small movement, a brown tail, thin, twitching. Claire dropped to her knees and pulled away the debris, and there he was, a tiny puppy, the same golden black coat, the same eyes. He was curled into the dust, ribs protruding like wires under skin, tongue dry and stuck to the roof of his mouth. But his eyes, they were alive, terrified, yes, but alive. And they were staring not at Claire, but at the tree behind her. He had stayed hidden, watching, waiting, while his mother bled and suffered. He had stayed near, not running away. His tiny paws were raw from scratching at the dirt, as if trying to dig something, or maybe trying to bury his fear. Claire scooped him up, and the moment she turned back, the puppy whimpered loud, sharp, and struggled in her arms. Claire looked down and saw what he was seeing. His mother had collapsed, not unconscious, but no longer standing. Her breathing had slowed, eyes fluttering. Whatever strength had held her upright had now given out. The puppy cried louder, a wail, not just fear, grief, as if he was trying to say something no human language could contain. Claire rushed back, laying the puppy beside his mother. He pressed his tiny head into her chest, nuzzling the wounds, licking the dried blood like he could fix it. She stirred, barely, and her eye opened enough to see him, just enough. She exhaled, a sound, not quite a breath, not quite a cry. And that was when Claire realized this wasn't just about rescuing a dog. This was about something deeper. A bond forged not in comfort, but in suffering. A bond so strong, even near death couldn't sever it. The mother had stayed alive not for herself, but for him. And the puppy had not left because he believed, somehow, that someone would come. That love, or fate, or mercy would arrive. And now it had. But the question remained, who had done this? Why here? Why this tree, this rope, this silence? The town was small. People talked. Someone knew. And someone had chosen not to act. Claire's jaw tightened as she stared at the red rope. Not just a tool of cruelty, but a signature. Whoever did this had meant to leave a message. But now, the message had changed. Because the dog was no longer alone, and neither was her pup. What happened next would unravel more than just a rescue. It would tear open secrets buried deeper than the sand, and lead Claire down a path that would not only test her courage, but uncover something no one in the town ever expected. The sun had started to dip, stretching long golden fingers across the desert as Claire crouched beside the German shepherd. The mother dog no longer had the strength to lift her head, but her eyes stayed on her pup, never breaking that sacred connection. The red rope was so deeply embedded in her hind legs that her fur had matted around it in patches of blood and sand. Every breath she took came with the sound of struggle. Claire pulled out her trauma shears, her fingers trembling as she began to cut the rope. It wasn't just thick, it was soaked, hardened with blood, as though it had been meant to last longer than her will. She whispered to the dog as she worked, words meaningless in language, but heavy with compassion. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. She just let Claire continue, as though some deep part of her recognized that help had finally come. The moment the last strand of rope fell away, the dog's legs buckled, and she slumped into Claire's lap, motionless but still, breathing. Claire cradled her, feeling the bony frame press against her chest. The puppy scrambled forward, pawing at Claire's knee, demanding to be close to his mother. Claire reached over with her free arm, scooping him against her side, and for a second, they were all pressed together, rescuer, mother, and son, a fragile constellation of survival in a landscape built for forgetting. The puppy barked from across the room, his tiny voice bouncing off the tiled walls. Claire turned to see him scratching at the metal cage he was in, eyes wide, crying again. She opened the door, and he bolted across the room, leaping onto the table beside his mother, curling into her side like a heartbeat returning to its chest. Claire let him stay. The shepherd's breathing steadied with every passing hour. Fluids dripped into her veins, and pain meds dulled the edges of her suffering. Claire wrapped her in warm blankets, watching the rise and fall of her chest, praying it wouldn't stop. She wasn't out of danger, not yet, but she was no longer alone, and that changed everything. Around midnight, Claire sat down beside the table, legs numb, eyes stinging. She thought about the rope again. It wasn't frayed or snapped. It had been tied with care. Not fast, not in fear, but methodically. That was the part that haunted her. Whoever did this didn't do it in a moment of rage. They did it in quiet calculation, and that meant they could do it again. Claire took photos of the wounds, of the rope, of the tree. She sent them to her friend in animal control, typing one sentence beneath the images. "We have to find who did this." The shepherd stirred again, eyes fluttering. Claire leaned close, brushing back the fur from her face. "You're safe now," she whispered. "He's safe. You did everything, right?" The dog didn't respond, not with a sound, but she blinked slowly, and Claire took that as enough. By morning, the news had spread. Claire had uploaded one photo, just one, to a private rescue forum. Within hours, it had been shared across groups, pages, timelines. People were outraged, heartbroken. Offers to help flooded in: food, medicine, blankets, donations. The town that had once looked the other way was now staring straight into its own guilt. But amid the support, there were other messages too. One, in particular, stood out. No name, just a message. "Leave it alone. Some things are better left buried." Claire froze. She read it twice, then deleted it. This wasn't over. Someone didn't want this dog's story told, but Claire had already made a silent vow, forged in the desert, sealed with the cry of a puppy who had refused to abandon his mother. This story would be told, and someone would have to answer for it. The clinic had never felt more silent than it did on that second morning. Claire sat by the recovery table, staring at the German shepherd whose body was now wrapped in soft gauze and clean bandages. The mother, whom she had begun calling Hope, was still sleeping. Her body curled protectively around her puppy, who refused to leave her side. The little one had been fed, bathed, and cuddled, but nothing seemed to calm him like being pressed against her chest. Claire watched them for hours, not only as a veterinarian, but as someone trying to decode a mystery hidden deep inside their scars. These wounds told a story, but it wasn't just the rope or the desert that haunted them. Something older lived, in their eyes, a darkness that had been building. For far longer than a few days in the sun, Claire decided to begin her search with a scan. A microchip might lead her somewhere, perhaps a name, an address, a clue. She lifted Hope's paw gently and scanned beneath the fur near her shoulder. A beep, a chip. Her heart jumped. The data came up on the screen. The name of a breeder 3 towns away. The dog had been registered 4 years ago under the name Delilah. Claire whispered the name aloud, and for a fleeting second, the dog stirred. As if somewhere in the storm of trauma and exhaustion, that name still echoed in her soul. Claire made a call. The breeder picked up a man with a gravelly voice, who sounded more irritated than concerned. Delilah. Haven't heard that name in years, he muttered. Sold her to a couple near Dry Ridge. Young folks. Didn't keep in touch. Why? Claire hesitated. She was found tied to a tree, tortured, left for dead. There was silence on the other end. Then a long sigh. Wouldn't surprise me, he finally said. Some folks just shouldn't own dogs, but once they pay, it's out of my hands. He hung up without another word. Claire's jaw clenched. She looked down at the sleeping shepherd Eliland, felt the rage coiled beneath her skin. This wasn't neglect. This was something deeper. Someone didn't just give up on her. They tried to erase her. Digging further, Claire traced a trail through old vet records. Delilah had been brought in once, nearly 2 years ago, for a broken paw. The records showed untreated burns on her back, explained away as an accident, with a grill. The file was closed without follow-up. Claire could feel it. This wasn't the first time Delilah had been in danger. It had been happening for years, and no one had stopped it. Until now. That night, Claire sat with a notebook, sketching timelines, piecing together what she could. A young couple had bought her. She'd had a litter of puppies last year, no documentation. But someone had posted online, trying to sell purebred German pups. The photo, faded and pixelated, showed Delilah in the background, skinny even then, chained to a post behind a trailer. Claire zoomed in, studying every detail. A rusted water bowl, a child's toy, half buried in dirt, and in the far back corner, barely visible, a man standing in the shadows, watching. Claire's stomach turned. She printed the photo, tacked it to the clinic's corkboard, and circled the man. "We'll find you," she whispered. Delilah-no. Hope began waking more often now. She no longer flinched when Claire approached. Her eyes followed her through the room, blinking slowly, calmly. Trust was returning, fragile as ash, but still burning. The puppy had begun to play, darting around the recovery room with the awkward limbs of a child finally learning the world wasn't only made of pain. Claire had named him Shadow because he never left his mother's side, not for food, not for toys, not for anything. They were pieces of each other, and that bond had survived what most wouldn't. One morning, Claire was cleaning the cage when she noticed something unusual. Shadow had a small mark beneath his fur, strange line of scar tissue across his back. At first, she thought it might have been from birth, but as she examined it closely, her breath caught. It was the shape of a belt buckle. He had been struck. Deliberately, recently. Rage clawed at her throat. How could someone hurt a puppy this small? How could they harm an animal who only knew how to love? The images began to swirl together now. Delilah was bred too early, used for her puppies, kept chained, beaten, then abandoned. And yet, she had survived. Not just for herself, but for the one pup she could protect. Shadow was the last. The only. Claire knew now that the others were likely sold, maybe worse. But Shadow remained, because she had shielded him. In that desert, where no one would see, she had endured the rope, the wounds, the sun so that he could live. Claire posted again, this time, not to forums, but publicly. She shared Hope's story, her real name, her abuse, the rescue. Not the graphic photos, but enough to shake the soul. And people responded, not just with sympathy, but with outrage. with leads. A woman messaged her saying she had bought one of Delilah's puppies last year, but the seller vanished. She'd always suspected something was off. Another message came in. I think I know where the trailer is in that photo. And another. He used to live near my cousin. Always kept his dogs outside. Moved a few months ago. The clues piled up. Claire forwarded everything to animal control. They began an investigation. A name surfaced. Then an address. The man had fled, but the land was still registered in his name. Officers went out. What they found made them sick. Embedded in trees, empty cages, evidence of fights. But no dogs, only signs of ghosts. Back in the clinic, Hope began to walk again. First a few steps, then a few more. Her legs shook, but Shadow would rush to her side and nuzzle against her chest. And somehow, that made her stronger. Claire watched it happen not as a vet, but as a witness to a miracle. Healing wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. Something unspoken then. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of forgiveness, Hope stood at the gate of the clinic, looking out into the open field. She didn't bark. She didn't run. She just stood there, tall and quiet, as Shadow sat beside her, tail flicking softly in the dirt. Claire walked up behind them and placed a hand on each of their backs. "You're not going back," she said. "Not ever." They didn't turn to look at her, but she knew they understood. Hope's past was filled with horror, but it had not claimed her, and Shadow's future would never be chained to that same cruelty. They had broken the cycle, not by revenge, not by rage, but by staying together, by enduring, surviving, and finally, being seen. But Claire still had one question that lingered in the back of her mind, even as peace returned to her home. Why did he leave her alive? Why tie her there instead of letting her die in silence? Why make it a scene, unless he wanted someone to find her? Unless this was a message, and that question answered, looming was, what would push Claire to take the next step? The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the clinic, like a quiet promise. It was soft, golden, and calm, the kind of light that doesn't demand attention, but offers it, gently. Outside, the trees shimmered from last night's rain, and the earth smelled alive. Inside, Claire stood beside Hope's recovery pen, holding a clipboard she barely glanced at anymore, because in front of her, something more important was unfolding, something years of medical training couldn't teach. Hope was standing now, not shakily, not with struggle, but with purpose. Her coat was fuller. The deep cuts around her legs had healed into smooth, pale scars. But more importantly, her eyes had returned, not as they were in that first haunting image, when she was tied to a tree, abandoned, barely breathing. No, now they were bright, curious, alert. She looked up when Claire entered, not with fear, but with recognition. And when Echo stirred beside her, yawning as he uncurled from her side, Hope nudged him gently with her nose. They moved like a pair of ghosts who had returned to the living, soft, quiet, but present. Echo had become her. Shadow in reverse, young, where she was worn, unscarred, where she bore pain, but they were inseparable. He slept beside her, watched over her, and often whimpered when she wasn't within sight. Sometimes at night, when Claire made her rounds, she would find them in the corner of the kennel yard, under the stars. Hope would be watching the sky. Echo would be asleep under her chin. But today was different. Today was the day Claire had to make a decision she hadn't prepared herself for, because the foundation that offered to fund her expansion had one request: that Hope and Echo come, live with them at their sanctuary upstate. A quiet, expansive forest, far from city noise, full of open land and love. It was perfect, but it also meant goodbye. Claire sat with them that afternoon, on the cool stone patio behind the clinic. Shadow was there too, his chin resting on her knee. Hope lay beside her, calm, content. Echo chased a leaf, tumbling over his own paws. Claire watched them and felt her throat tighten. She had never intended to keep them. That was never part of the plan. But somewhere between the surgery, the sleepless nights, the rescue missions, and the soft, almost imperceptible healing of trust, she had fallen in love with them, with Hope's quiet courage, with Echo's desperate need to believe the world could be kind. Letting them go felt like tearing out part of her ribs. She reached out and placed a hand on Hope's chest. "You saved him," she whispered. "You stayed alive so he could find you." Hope blinked, then leaned into her touch. That evening, just before dusk, the sanctuary team arrived. A kind older woman named Eleanor stepped out, eyes gentle, her voice soft like silk draped over wood. She knelt without speaking, waited, and when Hope approached on her own, tail wagging just slightly, Eleanor smiled. "She's ready," she said. Claire nodded, but when she reached to clip the leash on, her hands trembled. The drive to the sanctuary was 3 hours. Claire followed in her own car, watching as the transport van moved ahead. Each mile felt like a goodbye letter she couldn't bring herself to finish. At one point, she almost pulled over, almost turned around, but then Echo pressed his face against the van window and stared at her, eyes wide, full of something that wasn't fear or sadness. It was gratitude. The sanctuary sat at the edge of a hill, where pine trees whispered and birds sang without hesitation. There was no smell of bleach, no buzz of fluorescent lights, only earth and air. The moment the van door opened, Hope stepped out first, her paws pressing into soil like they belonged there. She took 3 steps, stopped, turned around. Claire crouched and opened her arms, and without hesitation, Hope ran to her. It wasn't panic, it wasn't confusion. It was closure. She buried her face in Hope's fur and whispered everything she couldn't say out loud, every memory, every sleepless hour, every prayer, every broken piece she had gathered and stitched back together inside herself just to get this far. "You're safe now," she said. "You're free." When they finally parted, it wasn't with pain. It was peace. Weeks passed. Claire continued her work. The new wing of the clinic was built. They called it Hope's Haven. A photo of Hope and Echo hung near the front door, a gift from Eleanor, showing them sunbathing together near a lake, both asleep, touching Paws. Shadow, older now, still followed Claire room to room. Sometimes he'd stop by the photo and just stare, and Claire would smile, touch his head, and whisper, "She made it." One morning, Claire received a letter. No return address, just a small paw print stamped in blue wax. Inside was a single photograph, Echo bigger now, confident leading a group of young rescues through a forest trail. Hope stood at the back, her eyes watching all of them, still protective, still present, still leading, even in silence. And with it came a note. Some animals heal. Some animals teach others too. She's doing both. Claire sat on the bench outside the clinic, holding that note. The wind played with her hair, the same wind that had once carried cries through empty trees. Now it carried something else, something warm. She closed her eyes. Hope had been tied to a tree and left to die. But what happened next didn't just shock people. It changed them. It reminded the world that survival wasn't just endurance, it was love, and that love, once given freely, never truly lets go. Not even when it's time to say goodbye. Maybe you've never found a dog tied to a tree in the middle of the woods. Maybe you've never heard the faint cries from a puppy who refused to abandon his dying mother. Maybe you've never looked into the eyes of an animal who had already been written off by the world. But somewhere right now, someone else has. Somewhere, a dog like Hope is shivering in the cold. Not because she's weak, but because someone made her believe she doesn't matter. Somewhere, a pup like Echo is pacing in circles, whimpering, waiting for a miracle that may never come. And the difference between life and death for them could be you. This isn't just a story about survival. It's a mirror. It shows us how little effort it truly takes to make a difference, and how devastating the silence of inaction can be. Hope was found by chance, but she lived because someone chose not to turn away. Her pain was undeniable, but her strength, unforgettable. And what about Echo? He wasn't just a witness to cruelty. He was the light that refused to go out, a heartbeat that kept believing, even when the world gave him no reason to. Think about that for a moment. How many Echoes are still out there right now? How many hopes are bound, abandoned, forgotten, and waiting? The shelters are overflowing. Rescue teams are exhausted. Good people are doing their best with broken tools and tighter budgets. But we can't do this alone. Not anymore. If you felt something watching this story, if you paused, even for a moment, then you're already part of the solution. Adopt, foster, donate, share. Even a single post, a forwarded link, or a kind word can ripple into something life-changing. For the ones who can't speak for themselves, and if nothing else, just look around. Really look, because the next hope might not be far from you. She might be hiding beneath a dumpster behind a supermarket. She might be wandering along the side of a quiet country road. She might be lying, tied to a tree, waiting for someone to care. Someone like you. Her name may not be Hope, but if you reach her in time, she'll never forget that you did. This isn't where the story ends, it's where yours begins.